Hello, everyone, and welcome to Study Hall, the podcast where a 20th century French philosopher, yours truly, and a 20th century American psychologist rummage through history, theology, and everything else that might spark your curiosity. I'm Michel Foucault, and with me is the ever insightful B.F. Skinner. B.F., how are you doing today?
Hey, Michelle, I'm doing well. Well enough that I'm actually excited to talk about the Sermon on the Mount. I gotta say, it's not every day that a behaviorist gets to dissect ancient religious texts with a French philosopher who's known for analyzing power structures. But here we are, so let's have some fun with it.
Indeed. And for our listeners, if you're expecting a super formal, footnoted academic exposition, let me just say, this is Study Hall. We're casual, we're witty, we're academically rigorous, but not like dry as dust about it. So yeah, if you love the intersection of religion, textual tradition, psychology, and social theory, you're in the right place.
Absolutely, and since we're basically bridging the distance between, first century Judea and the modern coffee shop crowd, we want to keep this relatable. We'll talk about how the Sermon on the Mount got written, or at least compiled, how it's been translated across centuries, Greek, King James Version, K-DV, English Standard Version, ESV, New American Bible, NAB, and why any of that matters if you're not, a professor in a theology department.
Yes, and I think it's essential to highlight that the Sermon on the Mount comprises Matthew chapters 5 to 7 in the New Testament, widely revered as a core ethical text in Christianity. You've got the Beatitudes, those blessed are the poor in spirit lines. Then there's the Lord's Prayer, among other teachings like turning the other cheek, not judging others, so on. It's the bedrock of a lot of Christian moral thought. Even if you're not religious, you'll see references all around. From Netflix dramas to pop songs that reference salt of the earth, all that stuff.
Yep, it's basically saturating Western culture. And from my vantage point as a behaviorist, it's kind of like a set of moral reinforcements. Behave meekly and get X reward, or hunger for righteousness and receive Y benefit. But we'll get into that in due time. Let's start by framing how we'll chat about this. We've got the historical context, the significance of the text, the major translations, how these translations differ, especially in key sections like the Beatitudes and the Lord's Prayer, and then some broader discussion on how these differences actually change how people act, think, pray, and maybe even judge each other.
Cool, so let's set the scene. The Sermon on the Mount is ascribed to Jesus, a first-century Jewish teacher, in the Gospel of Matthew. Whether you approach that historically, theologically, or from any other lens, it's widely recognized as a foundational moral discourse. It's basically, how do I put it, the Magna Carta of Christian ethics, in the sense that it sets down radical principles about humility, mercy, righteousness, forgiveness. It reorients moral priority inward, right? Anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. That sort of intensification of moral accountability.
Yep, exactly. And, from a 21st century vantage point, we sometimes take these ideas for granted. But historically, the emphasis on thought life as being morally consequential was a big shift. In a typical behaviorist approach, it's fascinating. You're basically encouraging individuals to watch not just their actions, but the potential antecedents in their own mind. That's a big leap from a purely external, do this, don't do that. Now it's also, don't even think about that. Or, pay attention to your intentions. We'll see how different translations handle that imperative.
Well said. And let's keep in mind that the Gospel of Matthew was written in Greek, though Jesus would have spoken primarily Aramaic. So from the get-go, we have a translation from Jesus' likely words to Greek. Then, centuries later, from Greek manuscripts into Latin, then from Latin or Greek into various vernaculars, eventually English. That's where we get the KJV, the ESV, the NAB, and so on. Each step is a filter.
Yes, a big game of telephone if you think about it, though I don't want to imply it's all just random distortion. There's scholarly rigor in many of these translations, but each translation is shaped by context. The King James Version, for instance, was commissioned in 1611 by King James I of England. That is a very distinct historical moment with certain linguistic forms, thee, thou, didst, etc., that produce that majestic tone. Meanwhile, the ESV is a modern evangelical translation from 2001, so it's got a more contemporary ring, but still tries to remain fairly literal. The NAB is a Catholic translation, revised multiple times, with footnotes and a desire to connect Old Testament contexts. Each emerges from a different institutional and theological environment, which we'll talk about.
Right. And dear listeners, if you're the type who's thinking, so what if it says earth or land? Big deal. Well, to me, these small changes matter because they shape the entire horizon of meaning. The word choices can influence how you conceptualize a promise, like inheriting the earth versus inheriting the land. And that difference might open up different genealogies of interpretation and practice.
I love that you use the word genealogies, Michel. It's so you. For me, it's about how each term can shape a behaviorist stimulus-response relationship differently. If you're reading, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," that might evoke something about universal dominion, a global sense of humility, being rewarded. If you read, "Inherit the land," you might imagine something more concrete, like Old Testament promises about the promised land. So each phrase could trigger slightly different emotional and behavioral resonances.
Exactly. So let's pivot to the actual text, starting with the Beatitudes. That's Matthew 5:3-12. Often we get lines like, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," or "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." The structure is basically a pronouncement of who's blessed, followed by the reward. In Greek, the term used is makarioi, makarioi, which can also be rendered as happy or fortunate. The King James folks went with blessed, giving it that stately ring. Some modern translations might prefer happy, but that changes the tone a bit, right?
Yes, happy sounds almost casual, like reading a self-help book. Happy are the poor in spirit. That might actually reduce some of the majesty or seriousness, making it feel more like a modern psychological statement of well-being. Meanwhile, blessed preserves that sense of theological weight, like you're bestowed with divine favor. So a very small shift. Happy versus blessed. Possibly big psychological ramifications.
Let's read some lines in different translations. Maybe we'll show how the KJV phrases it, then a modern one like the ESV, and see if we notice anything. KJV. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. ESV. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. NAB. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. At first glance, those are almost identical, but you see the subtle punctuation difference in KJV, colon instead of a comma. And sometimes the KJV might use phrases like, "Blessed are they which do hunger," instead of, "Blessed are those who hunger." Just that archaic construction. So, in the actual text, the differences might be more subtle.
Yes, and those differences matter. If you read the KJV out loud, it has a certain melodic gravity, which historically shaped English-speaking Protestant spirituality. People might not even realize how they've internalized that sense of, this is how the Word of God sounds. So the KJV vibe can evoke more reverence. If you're reading the ESV, you might say, oh, that's nice and straightforward, I get it. The result might be a closer sense of personal accessibility, but maybe less grandiose.
That's an interesting point about accessibility versus grandeur, and we can see it in the next line. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness. KJV versus blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. ESV or NAB. One sounds older, but also more formal, while the other is simpler. And if you want a comedic angle, you might remember the Monty Python bit in The Life of Brian. Blessed are the cheesemakers, satirizing the way people can mishear these lines. A testament to how big a deal the Beatitudes are in pop culture.
Yeah, I can't help but recall that scene. It's comedic, sure, but it underscores how translations and hearing can shape meaning or mismeaning. Now let's highlight the earth versus land distinction, which is found in the verse about the meek. The Greek text uses gamma eta, GE, which can be earth, land, or soil. The KJV and ESV say, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. The NAB sometimes says the land, or in footnotes emphasizes promised land connotations. So if you're Catholic and reading the NAB, you might get an Old Testament link more strongly.
Yes, that's a big interpretive shift. Inherit the earth might conjure up universal dominion or cosmic scope. Inherit the land might make you think specifically of Israel's covenant or some localized sense of inheritance. A question for our listeners. If you were reading this personally, which version resonates more with your worldview? A universal promise or a particular inheritance referencing deeper Old Testament narrative threads? Because which resonates more might clue you into the theological lens you prefer.
And from a purely behavioral perspective, you might be more strongly motivated if you view the reward as local and tangible. Or maybe you're more motivated by the cosmic sense. Everyone's different, so these translations can shape the moral imagination in different ways. That's part of what's so fascinating about dissecting small words in a big text.
Absolutely. Now let's jump into the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6:9-13. One of the most famous prayers in Christianity. If you're from a Catholic background, you might be used to saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And so on, eventually getting to, Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. But if you read the text in Greek or in many Protestant Bibles, it's typically, Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. So is it debts or trespasses? People can get quite passionate about this.
Yes, you see it in ecumenical gatherings. Everyone's praying the Lord's Prayer together, but some folks say debts, while others say trespasses, and you get that slightly awkward collective mumble. But the Greek is ophilemata, meaning debts, or what is owed. So strictly speaking, debts is closer to the direct translation. But the Catholic tradition often uses trespasses from an older liturgical practice that references Luke's version or just centuries of usage. That shift from an economic metaphor to a more boundary-crossing metaphor can shape how you conceive of sin.
Exactly. If your main concept of sin is debt, you might treat your moral life like a ledger. God's the creditor, you're the debtor. Christ is the one who pays off your debts, etc. If your main concept is trespass, you might treat it more like a property line. You stepped onto God's property. You have to get back in bounds to rectify that. So these metaphors hold sway over how entire theological systems get constructed. Protestant reformers often hammered home the debt idea. We owe a debt we cannot pay. That resonates with a certain interpretation of atonement. Meanwhile, Catholic tradition might emphasize crossing a boundary and moral wrongdoing that must be reconciled through sacraments and penance. So, yeah, that's not a trivial difference.
I always think about the psychological angle. If I'm raised to see sin as an unpaid debt, I might be worried about an outstanding moral balance, like I'm living in spiritual debt collection territory. If I'm raised to see sin as trespass, I might conceptualize it as crossing lines and needing to step back in line. They're different emotional frameworks. Both can produce guilt, but that guilt might manifest differently. One is I owe. The other is I crossed a boundary. So for you listeners, maybe ask yourselves, which resonates more with my experience of guilt or wrongdoing?
We also have that line about, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The NAB phrases it differently in some editions. Do not subject us to the final test, but deliver us from the evil one. That's quite a shift in emphasis. Instead of everyday temptation, it's eschatological. Don't let us face the final trial basically suggests a big end times showdown.
Yeah, that's huge. If you're reciting the prayer daily in English, you might be focusing on mundane moral pitfalls like, please, God, don't let me get lured into lying, cheating, or missing my responsibilities. That's how many interpret, lead us not into temptation. But if you're reading the NAB version about the final test, you might think it's referencing the ultimate trial at the end of life or the end of the world. Very cosmic. That would shape your sense of what to watch out for. Is it everyday Netflix binging or the Book of Revelation-style tribulation?
Yes, exactly. Another phrase that changes is deliver us from evil versus deliver us from the evil one. Is it a general moral evil, or is it a personal, personified Satan? The theology can pivot significantly. Catholics often emphasize that personal dimension, Satan as a real adversary, while some Protestants do as well, though the older English translations might keep it vague. That's an interpretive choice that shapes your spiritual worldview, right?
Definitely. If you believe you're up against an actual entity, you might adopt a spiritual warfare approach to daily life. If you think it's just evil in the abstract, you might see it more as a principle or a force. That's a pretty significant difference in how you navigate moral challenges.
We can't forget the doxology. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. Amen. If you've ever been in a Catholic Mass, you might notice that's not recited as part of the prayer. It's actually separated. Meanwhile, in a Protestant service using the King James Version or English Standard Version, you might recite it together with the Lord's Prayer. So what's going on there?
Historically, that line doesn't appear in the earliest Greek manuscripts. It seems to have been added in later manuscripts or as a liturgical flourish. Then it got folded into the text that undergirds the KJV. Catholic tradition typically follows textual criticism that omits it, or they place it outside the core prayer. Protestants usually keep it. Another subtle difference that can cause confusion in ecumenical settings.
And let's not forget the power dimension. The Church of England was effectively the state church in 17th century England, so the KJV became the official English Bible. That doxology shaped how many millions ended the Lord's Prayer for centuries. Meanwhile, Roman Catholics standardized a shorter version referencing earlier manuscripts. So you have these two massive institutions each, in effect, codifying distinct forms of the prayer. All right, so we've looked at the details. Let's get big picture. Why do these textual tweaks matter in the everyday sense? Are we just talking about historical curiosities, or do they have real consequences for the average person?
I'd argue real consequences, definitely. Let's do a quick case study. Imagine a small church in the Midwest that uses the ESV. The language is fairly modern. Forgive us our debts. They might focus on a theology that includes some sense of moral indebtedness. They might preach a lot about how Christ pays your debt. Meanwhile, a Catholic parish across the street using the NAB and saying, "Forgive us our trespasses," might highlight crossing moral lines. Over generations, you can get slightly different flavors of guilt, redemption, confession, or penance. That can shape how people approach daily ethical dilemmas.
Absolutely. And from my genealogical approach, it's fascinating to see how these differences feed into broader discourses on power. A text that frames sin as debt might tie into certain economic metaphors: atonement as a transaction, redemption as payoff. That can, in turn, link to how the church might handle charity, penance, or even social issues like indebtedness and poverty. Meanwhile, if you're focusing on trespass, that might shift the rhetoric to boundary violations, property lines, or moral lines. Subtle but tangible.
Yes. And there's also the question of how personal your God is. If you're saying, "Deliver us from the evil one," you might see your moral life as being in direct conflict with a personal adversary, Satan. That might lead to a more urgent sense of spiritual battle in daily life. If your text says, "Deliver us from evil," you might focus more on resisting abstract negative influences or internal vices. Different forms of prayer, different emphasis in sermons, different counseling approaches by pastors.
Exactly. Another angle is that these differences can shape ecumenical or interdenominational dialogue. If you're trying to unify a group of Christians, you might have to navigate those translation differences. Are we praying debts or trespasses? Are we saying the final test or temptation? Are we tacking on the doxology or not? Sometimes these minute differences can become big theological fault lines, or they can be stepping stones to deeper unity if recognized and respected.
I've seen that in group gatherings where each person just says whatever their tradition says. So you get a weird moment in the prayer where half the group is on one word, half on another. But ironically, it can be a moment of humility, like, "Oh, wait, we each have a unique vantage point." Maybe that fosters empathy.
Yeah, empathy or confusion, but hopefully empathy. Now, if we pivot to the idea of the modern reader who might not be religious, why care? Well, even from a purely secular standpoint, the Sermon on the Mount has shaped Western moral imagination for centuries. This is the text that gave us, "Judge not, that you be not judged," or "Turn the other cheek," or "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So it's embedded in everything from Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches to Dostoevsky's novels. Understanding how it's been translated can help you see the layers in pop culture references, legal frameworks, or moral debates.
Right. So maybe let's ask a question for our listeners. How many of you have encountered references to the Sermon on the Mount in, say, a TV show, movie, or novel? Did you recognize the reference immediately? Did you ever realize the phrasing might come from a particular translation? Maybe you heard something about the salt of the earth in a show like The Walking Dead, or you caught a cameo line about not letting your left hand know what your right hand is doing in some comedic context. The language might differ slightly, but the concept is the same.
Yes, and it's intriguing to see how the comedic or dramatic effect can shift depending on whether the reference uses older, more formal wording or a modern paraphrase. Another question: have you ever tried reading 2 or 3 translations side by side? If you do that with, say, the Beatitudes or the Lord's Prayer, you might be shocked at how certain lines get reconfigured. It's a fantastic exercise if you're a lifelong learner wanting to hone your interpretive skills.
Absolutely. It's like a compare and contrast mental workout. I've known some folks who keep parallel Bibles, like a big text with multiple translations on each page. That's the ultimate way to see the divergences instantly. Although, fair warning, you might go down a rabbit hole of analyzing synonyms for blessed or happy.
That's the best kind of rabbit hole, though, if you ask me. And on the pop culture note, it's not just Monty Python. We've seen references to turning the other cheek in countless movies, sometimes ironically, sometimes earnestly. People might interpret it in different ways. Does it mean you're a pushover? Or does it mean you're morally strong for resisting retaliation? The text can be read differently depending on translation and theological lens.
Yes, and let's not forget the usage in activism. Martin Luther King Jr. famously drew on the Sermon on the Mount's principles of nonviolence and empathy. He often quoted the text in a manner consistent with the King James style, because that was standard in African American preaching traditions. So the KJV's rhetorical power was a big part of the civil rights movement's moral force. If he'd been using a more modern translation, it might not have carried that same oratorical weight.
Indeed. Another example might be Dorothy Day, or the Catholic worker movement, leaning heavily on the trespasses and forgive us our trespasses aspects, focusing on community living, crossing boundaries, welcoming the poor, taking the Beatitudes as a social ethic. That's shaped an entire subculture of activism in Catholic circles. So these are tangible societal implications.
Now, I'd love to hear more from you, Michel, about how you see the role of institutions, like the Church of England for the KJV or the Catholic Church for the NAB, shaping these translations in a genealogical sense.
Certainly. In a genealogical perspective, no text is produced in a vacuum. The KJV was a product of the early 17th century under a monarch who also happened to be the head of the Church of England. They wanted a standardized English Bible that would unify religious practice and fortify the monarchy's authority. So the translation committee wasn't just a bunch of neutral scholars. They were shaped by the politics, theology, and linguistic standards of the time. That's one reason the KJV has this regal, commanding tone. It's partly a reflection of the monarchy's own sense of grandeur.
Makes sense. And the NAB?
The NAB is produced under the auspices of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So it's shaped by Catholic theological frameworks, especially post-Vatican II. There's an emphasis on contextual footnotes, tying Old Testament references to New Testament passages, clarifying theological points for Catholic believers, and so on. So again, the translators are not trying to hide their perspective. They want a text that is both faithful to the original languages and conducive to Catholic liturgical and catechetical needs. It's not purely academic, it's meant to be used in worship.
And that's crucial for how believers interpret these lines. If your official Bible includes footnotes about the evil one being Satan, or about land, meaning the promised land, that shapes your mental frames. So from an institutional perspective, each translation is also a means of guiding or influencing the faithful's reading. Not necessarily sinister, just a fact of how religious communities shape texts to reinforce certain theological stances.
Correct. That's how genealogical analysis works. To show that what we might assume is the plain text is often the product of layered historical processes. And each step has some interplay of power, knowledge, and dogmatic stance. If you read the original Greek, you're still reading a scholarly reconstruction of various manuscripts, each of which had scribal glosses, errors, or marginal notes. So even that's a product of textual criticism. The idea of a pure original is somewhat mythic.
So, turning back to psychology for a minute, let's do another scenario. Let's say a person grows up with the KJV. They hear sermons about, "Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled." The preacher emphasizes that filled suggests an abundance, an overflowing. Then that person moves to a new church that uses the ESV, which says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." Suddenly it's satisfied instead of filled. The new preacher teaches it's more about contentment than abundance. So the believer experiences a subtle shift in how they envision God's promise. Over time, that might alter their emotional relationship to spiritual pursuits.
Interesting. Because filled has a certain robust connotation, like it's a feast. Satisfied might be a bit more subdued, like you'll be content. So you see how a single lexical choice can produce different spiritual imaginations. Multiply that by dozens of differences across translations, and we see how entire denominations or individual believers can cultivate quite distinct moral sensibilities or emotional resonances.
That's exactly it. Behaviorally, if you're expecting abundance, your approach to spiritual practice might be more exuberant. If you're expecting a quiet satisfaction, maybe you're calmer about it. Not to oversimplify, but it's plausible. So yeah, these small differences can accumulate over a lifetime.
Now, some people might ask, if the differences matter, do we have to read multiple translations to get the true meaning? In the genealogical sense, there is no single true meaning that stands apart from interpretative frameworks. But I'd say reading multiple translations can broaden your understanding. You might glean insights from each variation.
I completely agree. And if you're not religious, it can still be eye-opening to see how historically these phrases got shaped. It's like a lens into cultural evolution. So I might encourage anyone with a curious mind, like hopefully you, dear audience, to occasionally pick up a parallel Bible or read an online tool that compares translations. Even if you just read the Beatitudes in 4 versions, you'll see how language frames meaning.
Totally. And speaking of pop culture once more, you'll catch references in everything from Bob Dylan songs to certain Marvel movies. You might hear a line like, "Judge not, lest ye be judged," in an unexpected cameo. That's a KJV phrasing. A modern script might say, "Don't judge, or you'll be judged." Different ring to it. So if you're attuned to these variations, you can detect the translator's footprint even in contemporary media.
Yes, precisely. And we might even see new paraphrases that aim to be super hip or relevant. Something like, "Hey, you, stop judging people unless you want them to judge you right back." That's obviously not how the KJV or ESV phrases it, but it might appear in a youth Bible somewhere. Then, from a behavior standpoint, that direct style might prompt a different reaction in teenage readers. Maybe they find it more personal, more convicting, or they might find it cringe, who knows?
Cringe can definitely happen with overly modern paraphrases, but at least it's an attempt to break the text out of stilted forms. Meanwhile, a scholar might want to stick close to the Greek. So there's a tension between dynamic equivalence, thought for thought, and formal equivalence, word for word. Each approach has its strengths and limitations.
Let's toss out more questions for you guys so you can do some mental chewing on these ideas. Have you ever noticed how your own Bible or religious text references might shape your moral expectations? If you switched translations, did that change your sense of spiritual identity or relationship with the text? If you're not religious, do you see any parallels between how translations shape theology and how reboots or adaptations shape a classic film's plot? I ask that third one because I think it's interesting. Like, if you watch the original Star Wars versus the special edition or a new edit, you're seeing the same narrative with tweaks. And sometimes those tweaks cause huge fandom debates. Similar dynamic, maybe,
Haha, yes, the Han shot first controversy among Star Wars fans is somewhat analogous to which do we say in the Lord's Prayer, debts or trespasses? In both cases, a textual or visual variation spawns intense debates about authenticity. People get pretty passionate, which underscores how these texts, whether biblical or cinematic, are living cultural artifacts. Our attachments to them are emotional as well as intellectual.
Right on. And in the same sense, readers might say, how dare you change that line from the KJV? That's how I memorized it in Sunday school. So it's that same territory of nostalgia, tradition, perceived authenticity, and so forth.
All right, we've touched on a lot. The historical significance of the Sermon on the Mount, differences in translations, the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, the doxology, and broader cultural or behavioral implications. Let's do a quick summary for the folks who might have dozed off in the middle, though hopefully not.
Sure thing. In summary, the Sermon on the Mount is a foundational Christian text in Matthew 5 to 7, hugely influential in Western ethics and beyond. Translations matter because each version, Greek original, KJV, ESV, NAB, carries unique word choices that shape theology, personal piety, and communal practice. Key differences appear in phrases like, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth land," or "Forgive us our debts as trespasses," or "Lead us not into temptation," versus "Do not subject us to the final test." These differences aren't trivial. They reflect institutional influences, theological priorities, and can produce different emotional, psychological, and social outcomes. Studying them reveals how language, power, and interpretation intersect, something Michel loves analyzing from a genealogical perspective, and I love analyzing from a behavioral perspective.
That's pretty much the gist. If we can leave you with one big takeaway, it's that you might never read or hear the Sermon on the Mount the same way again. You'll be more aware of the translation effect, so to speak. Maybe you'll reflect on how certain lines were shaped by centuries of cultural forces and how your personal or communal engagement with them is part of that ongoing chain.
Yeah, absolutely. And a final note for the non-religious or multi-faith folks out there, these interpretive dynamics exist in pretty much all major religious texts and even many secular classics. Plato's dialogues, the Tao Te Ching, the Bhagavad Gita, each has multiple translations with subtle differences that can reshape the text's meaning. If you're a lifelong learner, playing around with different translations can be a mind-expanding exercise not just for the Bible, but for any major text.
Right. If you want to see how language can mold your perspective, you can do the same with, say, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, or, as you said, the Tao Te Ching. Each translator picks words or phrases that color your interpretation. That's the power of language.
Michel, I think we should also emphasize that for a lot of people, these differences can inspire deeper community discussions. Let's say you're in a small group or a book club. You might actually read these passages in more than one version, talk about the feelings each version evokes. Maybe even do a little journaling exercise. How do I feel when I see "Forgive us our debts" as opposed to "Forgive us our trespasses"? What does that do to my understanding of forgiveness? That can lead to quite profound insights, I think.
Indeed, it's a fantastic approach, and it demystifies the notion that there's only one correct translation. The act of reading scripture, or any text for that matter, becomes less about passively receiving a final word and more about actively engaging with the text. You realize that the translator's choices are also interpretive acts. That fosters humility and openness, in my opinion.
Yes, humility, I like that word. Behaviorally speaking, it's about openness to new stimuli, being flexible rather than rigid. Rigidity would be insisting, no, there's only one perfect version, everything else is heresy. But, you know, the reality is that the Greek manuscripts themselves sometimes vary, scribes sometimes made notes, translations reflect denominational stances, etc. If you accept that, you become more open to a broader range of interpretive possibilities.
Exactly. And from the genealogical angle, we also realize how each translation can be a snapshot of power relations in a given era. That recognition doesn't have to undermine your faith or your appreciation for the text. It can enhance it by showing how deeply woven the text is into human history.
Couldn't agree more. And let's not forget that for many centuries, people fought over Bible translations, like William Tyndale, for instance, who ended up executed for translating the Bible into English before it was officially sanctioned. That tension between institutional authority and accessibility to the text is part of the story, too.
Yes, so each time we pick up a modern translation, we're benefiting from historical struggles and even tragedies that led to the possibility of reading scripture in our native tongue. Another big reason to pay attention to how translations are shaped.
All right, so what do we hope you, dear listeners, take away? I'd say be curious about your own assumptions when you read a particular Bible translation or any classic text. Embrace variety. Check out the KJV, the ESV, the NAB, or even the Greek if you're so inclined. Recognize that each translation is an interpretive act with historical, cultural, and theological baggage as well as blessings.
I might add, reflect on how these translations shape your moral outlook or your emotional responses. Discuss with others. Maybe start a mini study hall of your own, how the wording changes the sense of the text. Remember the bigger picture. Behind every line is a wide genealogical thread, from scribes to kings, from councils to modern publishers.
Yes, precisely. If you do that, you'll have a richer, more critical appreciation of a text that's been a cornerstone for so many. And even if you're not religious, it can be a fascinating exercise in cultural literacy.
Couldn't have said it better myself, B.F. Before we sign off, do you have any last bits of witty wisdom?
How about behaviorism teaches us that reading is a form of verbal behavior shaped by your environment. If your environment only includes one translation, you're missing out on some possible reinforcers. So expand your environment, read multiple translations. How's that?
I love it. Perfect Skinnerian spin there. And from the Foucauldian perspective, I'll say all translations are a form of power knowledge, producing the subjectivity of the reader. So, dear listeners, be mindful of the subject you become when you adopt a certain translation. Now, that might sound heavy, but hey, it's me, Michel Foucault.
Ha ha, indeed. All right, folks, that's it for Study Hall this week. We've meandered through the Sermon on the Mount, analyzing the intricacies of translations from archaic, blessed are they which, to modern, blessed are those who, from forgive us our debts, to forgive us our trespasses, from lead us not into temptation, to do not subject us to the final test. We hope you found this as enlightening as we did. If you have any feedback, hypothetical fan mail, or further questions, keep them in your mental mailbox. We'll be here next time to engage your curiosity.
Yes, thanks for joining our weird little cross-century confab. Stay curious, keep reading widely, and remember that every translation is a lens, not a mere window. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Until next time, keep those synapses firing and those genealogies unraveling.